It started with a knock, soft, deliberate, almost hesitant. At that hour, I wasn't expecting anyone, least of all my father. I thought he was asleep, just like the rest of the world. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there, something in his eyes told me this wasn't going to be one of those couldn't sleep, just checking in kind of moments. His shoulders looked heavier than usual, as if he was carrying a weight he'd never let me see until now. I invited him in, and what followed were words I never expected to hear from my dad. Words that turned my world inside out, not with chaos or drama, but with raw, quiet truth. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel, subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. That night had been long even before the knock came. I had spent hours trying to study for a licensing exam I had coming up, my third attempt, if I'm being honest. The pages of the prep book blurred together under the glow of my desk lamp, and my brain felt like it was wading through syrup. My name is Yurs, I'm 27, and that particular Tuesday had already wrung me out emotionally before the clock even struck midnight. The house was unusually quiet. My mom had gone to stay with her sister in Savannah for a few days, something about needing a break and recentering her energy, as she put it. That left just me and Dad under the same roof. We weren't exactly strangers, but we weren't close either. Not in the way that some people are with their fathers. We had our routine dinner, passing each other in the hallway, short conversations about the weather or the car needing an oil change. Never anything deeper. He was a good man, steady and hardworking, but emotionally distant. I used to think that was just the way he was wired. I was about to crawl into bed when the knock came. 3 light taps, not urgent, not rushed. Just enough to get my attention. I remember staring at the door for a second, wondering if I had imagined it. Then it came again, and I opened it. He stood there in his flannel pajama pants and a faded gray t-shirt, one hand at his side, the other gently gripping the doorframe. His silver hair was tousled, and he looked older than I remembered, tired even. There was a pause before either of us spoke. "Can I come in for a minute?" he asked, voice low. "Yeah, of course," I said, stepping aside. He sat on the edge of my bed while I settled back into my desk chair, legs tucked under me. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but it wasn't easy either. It felt like we were both waiting for someone else to give us permission to begin. "I didn't mean to keep you up," he said, staring down at his hands. "It's okay. I wasn't really sleeping." He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the floor. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, he looked up at me. His eyes were misty, not quite tears, but close enough. "I had a dream tonight," he said, "about my dad, your grandfather." I didn't say anything, just let him speak. It's been almost 30 years since he passed, but tonight, in that dream, he was sitting in his old chair on the porch, looking at me like he used to when I messed something up as a kid. You know that look, half stern, half waiting for you to figure it out on your own. I smiled faintly. I remembered Grandpa's chair. I remembered that look. "I sat next to him," Dad continued, "and I asked him something I never got to ask when he was alive. I asked him if he thought I was a good father." That sentence hit me in the chest. I leaned forward a little, my breath caught between listening and wanting to say something, but I didn't. I let him keep going. "He didn't answer," Dad said. "He just looked at me," and I woke up. He was quiet for a long moment, fingers rubbing his wedding band like it held some kind of answer. Then he looked at me again, really looked at me. "Yours, I've been thinking about you a lot lately, about how much you've been carrying on your own. The studying, the pressure you put on yourself, the way you try to make everything look easy even when it's not. I see it. I may not always say it, but I see it." I swallowed hard. My throat suddenly felt dry. "I don't know if I've ever made it easy for you to come to me, and that's something I think about more than you know." He paused, exhaled through his nose. "I want to be better at this, at being your dad. Not just the guy who fixes things around the house and pays the bills. I want to be someone you can lean on. Someone who tells you that it's okay not to have it all figured out, because God knows I didn't at your age." The room felt warmer suddenly, or maybe it was just my chest. Something cracked open quietly inside me, not in a painful way, more like a door I hadn't realized was even closed. I've made mistakes, he said softly. Too many times I stayed silent when I should have said something, or pushed you to be strong when you just needed someone to hold space for you. I can't undo that, but I want you to know that I'm here now. And I'm proud of you. Even when you feel like you're falling behind, I'm still proud. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tears slide down my cheeks. He noticed, of course, and opened his arms without a word. I stood up and crossed the room, letting myself fold into him like I hadn't done since I was a little girl with a scraped knee. For a long time, we just stayed like that. No words, just warmth, and a quiet understanding that something had shifted between us, something long overdue. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back. "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Dad," I whispered. And then he was gone, and I sat there in the quiet of my room, heart full of something I couldn't quite name yet, but knew I had been missing for a long time. The next morning, the world looked the same. Sunlight spilled through my curtains in that familiar golden haze. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the window, but everything felt different. There was a softness in the air I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I was seeing things through a different lens after what happened the night before. I lingered in bed longer than usual, not out of laziness, but reflection. My dad's words were still echoing in my mind, repeating quietly like a song I didn't want to forget. I had never heard him speak that way. So open, so vulnerable. It felt like he had peeled back years of distance between us in one night. I'd grown so used to our rhythm, polite, functional, familiar, but never intimate. And now I found myself wondering, what else hadn't I seen? Downstairs, the smell of coffee met me at the bottom of the staircase. I walked into the kitchen barefoot, wearing the oversized sweater I always reached for when I needed comfort. Dad stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He glanced up when he heard me, and something about the way he smiled, just a small, gentle thing, made my throat tighten again. "Morning," he said, handing me a mug. "Morning," I replied, wrapping my fingers around the warm ceramic. We sat in the breakfast nook, a small corner of the kitchen filled with morning light and old cushions that had faded from years of sun. Silence settled between us again, but it wasn't heavy like it used to be. It felt calm, comfortable. "You sleep okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, surprisingly well." He stirred his coffee, then looked at me, a little unsure. "I hope I didn't put too much on you last night." "You didn't," I said quickly. Actually, it meant a lot. There was a pause, then a slight nod. He seemed relieved. "I wasn't planning to come to your room," he said after a moment. "I was lying there, thinking about things, about you, and I just couldn't go to sleep until I said what I needed to say. I think I've been holding it in for years." I studied him. There were fine lines around his eyes I hadn't really noticed before. He looked tired, yes, but also lighter. Like speaking his truth had lifted something off him. "I think I've been holding things in too," I admitted. He glanced at me, interest in his eyes. "I've always felt like I had to be the strong one," I continued. "Not because anyone told me to, but, I don't know, I just picked it up. I saw how quiet you were, how hard you worked, and I thought maybe that's what being strong meant, keeping everything in." He nodded slowly, looking down at his coffee. "Maybe I taught you that without realizing it," he said. "My dad was like that too. He believed that emotions made you weak, that if something hurt, you swallowed it, moved on, never talked about it." "Did it work for him?" I asked. "My dad laughed once, low and dry. Not really. He died with so many things unsaid. I swore I'd be different, but sometimes patterns are hard to break." There was a vulnerability in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not just last night's version of it, this was deeper. A kind of quiet confession that made me realize just how many years of silence lived behind his steady eyes. "You know," he said, breaking the quiet again, "when you were a little girl, you used to come running to me with every scraped knee, every lost toy, every monster under the bed. You trusted me with everything. Somewhere along the way, I think I stopped showing you that I could still be that person." "You never stopped being him," I said, surprising both of us. He looked at me, his eyes glinting. "You really think so?" "I do," I said softly. "Even when we didn't talk about the hard things, I always knew you cared. I just didn't know how to reach you. And I guess I thought maybe you didn't want to be reached. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. I've made a lot of mistakes, years, but I don't want silence to be one of them anymore. There was a lump forming in my throat again, and I squeezed his hand gently. We spent the next hour just talking, really talking, about Mom, about his childhood, about my fears, my doubts, my future. He told me stories I had never heard before, about his first job, his fear of failing as a husband, the panic he felt the day I was born when they placed me in his arms, and he realized he had no idea what he was doing. And I shared things too, things I kept to myself for years. How I felt like I wasn't enough because I hadn't passed my exam yet. How I sometimes lay awake at night wondering if I'd ever make him proud. How I missed Mom when she left for her sisters, even though I never said it out loud. We were just two people, sitting in a sunlit kitchen, bridging a gap that had been growing quietly for years. By the time the clock hit 11, the coffee was long gone, and so was the distance between us. "I'm glad you knocked," I said as we got up to clear the mugs. He looked at me, eyes soft. "I almost didn't." "But you did," I said, "and it changed everything." He gave a little smile. "Yeah, I guess it did." That day passed slower than most. I went about my routine, studied a little, cleaned my room, took a walk, but everything felt more grounded. Like a part of me had finally found its footing after years of walking on uneven ground. And that night, as I lay in bed, I found myself hoping he'd knock again. Not because something needed fixing, but simply because I wanted to keep talking. Maybe healing didn't come in dramatic waves. Maybe it came in quiet knocks on quiet nights, when we finally dared to open the door. The next few days unfolded gently, like petals of a flower that had been waiting too long for spring. Nothing dramatic happened. No life-altering revelations, no explosive emotions. But there was a shift, subtle, steady, and unmistakable. My dad and I started spending more time together, not because we scheduled it or planned anything special, but because something had finally opened up between us. It was like we'd been living in neighboring rooms with the doors closed, and now those doors had quietly swung open. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, hunched over his old toolbox, trying to fix a wobbly lawn chair. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him struggle to thread a rusted bolt through a metal hinge. His brows were furrowed, his jaw tight. He looked the same as always, and yet somehow not. "You need an extra pair of hands?" I called out. He looked up, surprised but pleased. "Wouldn't hurt." I walked over and knelt beside him. He handed me the bolt without a word, and together we aligned the pieces, the silence between us filled with the creak of old tools and the scent of motor oil. It was mundane, but it felt sacred. Like we were repairing more than just a chair. After a while, he leaned back and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "You know," he said, "your mom used to come out here and sit with me when we first bought this house. She hated the garage, too cold, too dusty, but she came anyway." I smiled. "I can see that. She still hates dust." He chuckled. "Yeah, but she knew I needed the company. I wasn't great at asking for it." He paused, then looked at me. "Still not really." I didn't respond right away. I just sat beside him on the concrete floor, legs crossed, fingers picking at a thread on my sleeve. "Neither am I," I admitted. "Asking for company, I mean. I've always been the I got this kind of person. Even when I didn't." Dad nodded, his eyes soft. "That's the thing about independence. It's easy to confuse it with loneliness." The truth in that hit harder than I expected. I thought back to the countless times I had shouldered things alone, breakups, career setbacks, self-doubt, telling myself I was strong, capable, fine. But in reality, I've been quietly aching for someone to just notice, to say, "You don't have to do this by yourself." We sat there for a while longer, not saying much, just sharing the same space, and somehow that was enough. Later that evening, we ended up watching an old movie together in the living room, something from the 80s with a cheesy soundtrack and predictable plot, but we both laughed more than I expected. At one point, he reached for the remote to pause it and turned to me. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think I've been a good husband?" The question caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to answer it, wasn't even sure why he was asking me. I think you love Mom, I said carefully. And I think she loves you. That counts for a lot. He nodded, eyes on the screen, though the movie was frozen. Sometimes I wonder if she's happy, really happy, or if she just got used to me. That's a question only she can answer. He nodded again. Yeah, I guess I've been thinking a lot lately about who I've been, as a father, as a husband, as a man. There was something so etchingly human in the way he said it. No bitterness, no self-pity, just reflection. Honest, raw, unfiltered reflection. And it made me realize how often we think of our parents as finished people, as if they stop evolving once we're grown. But they're still on their journey too, still trying to get it right. You're not done becoming who you are, I said quietly. He turned to me, something in his expression unreadable. Neither are you. We smiled at each other, and it felt like we were seeing one another not as father and daughter for a moment, but just as two people, both flawed, both trying, both learning. The next day, Mom came back from Savannah. She was cheerful, chatty, and full of stories about her sister's new obsession with yoga. But I noticed something different between her and Dad. The way he looked at her, the way she touched his shoulder when she passed by. Something had softened. That night, after dinner, I walked past their bedroom and overheard them talking, really talking. Her voice was low, his even lower. I couldn't make out the words, and I didn't try to. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I needed to know. It felt like something private, something sacred, and I trusted them with it. In my own room, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the dark sky dotted with stars. I thought about how much had changed in such a short time, not in grand, sweeping ways, but in gentle turns, in pauses, in quiet words, in showing up. I used to think growth came in big, dramatic moments, graduations, new jobs, falling in or out of love. But maybe real growth comes when we stop pretending we're fine, when we say what needs to be said, when we sit with someone in silence and let it mean something. And maybe, just maybe, it starts with a knock. The following week unfolded with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. Not because life suddenly got easier, but because I finally stopped bracing for the weight of silence. Something had shifted in our home, not just between me and Dad, but in all the small spaces that used to feel hollow. The hallway didn't echo the same way. The dinner table, once quiet and practical, now held conversations that lingered after the last bite. Even Mom, though unaware of that late-night knock on my door, seemed to sense a new ease between us. One evening, a few days before my exam, Dad came home with something unexpected, a small, slightly beat-up wooden box. He placed it gently on the kitchen table and said, "I found this in the attic. Thought you might want it." I opened it slowly. Inside were pieces of my childhood I had long forgotten. A crumpled birthday card with my 8-year-old handwriting, a faded photo of me at a science fair holding a third-place ribbon, a note I had written to Santa, asking not for toys, but for my dad to come home early from work more often. I stared at the note for a long moment. The edges were soft, the ink barely legible, but the feeling behind it hit me hard. Dad sat down across from me and folded his hands. I used to read that note every Christmas. I kept it to remind myself of what I missed while I was so busy providing. My throat tightened, but I didn't look away. "Why are you giving it to me now?" "Because I think it's time you knew I've been carrying this too. And maybe it's time to let it go. For both of us." We sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Just being there, across the table from each other, was enough. The night before my exam, I was more nervous than I expected. I had studied hard, harder than ever before, but my thoughts kept drifting. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to force calm into my body. Just when I was about to turn off the light, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Dad again. "Can I come in?" he asked, just like before. I nodded, and he sat on the edge of the bed. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I just wanted to say I believe in you, no matter what happens tomorrow." "Thanks," I whispered. "I needed that." He was quiet for a second, then added, "But I hope you know I'd be proud of you either way." That part undid me. He didn't stay long. Just a few more words, a brief squeeze of my hand, and then he was gone again. But the space he left behind wasn't empty. It was full of something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The morning of the exam, I woke early, my stomach fluttering with nerves. But as I poured my coffee, I found a small sticky note on the kitchen counter. It was his handwriting. "Whatever happens, you're already enough. Love, Dad." The test came and went. I walked out of that exam room unsure, exhausted, but strangely calm. For the first time in a long while, my worth didn't feel tied to the outcome. When the results came in a week later, I passed. I cried. Not because I passed, although that was a relief, but because I finally felt free. Free from the invisible pressure I'd carried for so long. Free to fail, free to succeed, free to feel love either way. That night, we celebrated. Nothing fancy, just the three of us. Mom made her famous chicken and rice, and Dad picked out a bottle of sparkling apple cider from the store. We ate on the back porch, under string lights that flickered like little stars. The air was warm, the sky clear. As we sat around the table, laughing about something ridiculous Mom said, I looked at my dad. He caught my eye, gave me a soft smile, and raised his glass slightly. No words, just a look that said, "We made it here, didn't we?" And we had. It wasn't just about an exam, or a note, or a late-night conversation. It was about the quiet repair of something we both thought might never change. About reaching for each other through the noise of life and finding a way to say, "I'm still here. I still want this." I don't know what the future holds. There will be new challenges, new moments of silence, and maybe even more painful truths we'll need to speak aloud someday. But I'm not afraid of them anymore. Because now, I know what can happen when someone knocks. Gently, patiently, with love, and you choose to open the door.